My name is Kelly Gorman, and before I start my presentation, I just want to make a disclaimer just to say these are my views. They're my views only. They do not represent the CPA Ontario Council or not necessarily my colleagues at CPA Ontario. So that's my disclaimer, and I'm ready to go. Now, there's a lot of information in my presentation that Jim has already covered, so it's there and you can refer back to it, but I will probably skip over it and just talk about some of the more implementation issues or concerns with nuclear that we're grappling with as a profession. So, again, the framework Jim has set out. I think what's really important to call out, though, is that on this slide is that professional accountants, they still have to understand how the local laws and regulations work. So while nuclear doesn't require you to disclose, there might be laws out there where disclosure is required. So for example, the SEC will require people to come forward, lawyers and accountants, if they know that there's going to be significant financial harm. What they've said is we don't really care what your state bar rules are around confidentiality. You are required to come forward and report. So you just have to be mindful of when those disclosures are required. And as well, if nuclear is adopted, there might be certain laws where you can't actually follow the nuclear disclosures. That's set out in nuclear, and you don't have to, but you just have to make sure that you're following all the laws that are applicable, including nuclear and how they all kind of intersect together. Okay. So why was nuclear developed? And Jim alluded to a lot of this. And it really was created for situations where accountants, whether you're auditors, you're in business, you come across a known or a suspected noncompliance that's been committed. And so you really have an ethical responsibility not to turn a blind eye, but you're bound by a duty of confidentiality. And that duty of confidentiality is still in the CPA Code of Professional Conduct. So nuclear was really created so you could overcome that barrier. So if there's something that is significant, it's in the public interest to go forward and report it, it's basically setting aside the duty of confidentiality under the ISBA code. Again, we don't have that in Canada yet, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit further because that's something that we're actually working on. Again, Jim alluded to a lot of it. Nuclear is very extensive. These are the laws and the regulations that it covers. Today, just by way of example, I'm going to actually focus more on securities laws, just based on my background that before I came to CPA Ontario, I've been here for not quite 2 years, but prior to that I was at the OSC for 14 years, and more recently, the last 4 years, I was in enforcement, and I actually set up the Office of the Whistleblower. So I have a lot of experience in that area, so I'm going to use some of those examples just because I happen to know how the legislation works. So this was also on Jim's slides, but this is the framework, really, the objectives, which is the whole point of dealing with nuclear is by raising like even if you suspect it, non-compliance with laws and regulations to management or those charged with governance, that they have the ability to act on it. So they can rectify, remediate, or mitigate it, or maybe prevent it, which is the best result from happening in the first place. And then after that, the professional accountant, whether you're in business or you're the auditor, you still have to decide, do you take further action? And you might be resigning from your employer, you could be resigning from the engagement, but that's still not a substitute for looking at the public interest and saying, do I need to take further action? Even if not required by law, do I have to go out and report? And what's interesting is in the nuclear standard, because I find this paragraph a doozy, and I can see how when something goes wrong, we'll all be looking at this paragraph and parsing through because hindsight is 20/20. But one of the things that it talks about in a consideration when you're looking at this, in determining the need for and nature and extent of further action, the professional accountant shall exercise professional judgment and take into account whether a reasonable and informed third party, weighing all the specific facts and circumstances available to the professional accountant at that time, would be likely to conclude that the professional accountant has acted in the public interest. So that's quite a paragraph, and it'll be very interesting to see once we have exposure and experience in this across the world and in Canada, how this will actually work out in practice. So nuclear implementation. The The implementation is varied across the world. There's different countries that have brought it in. Some have brought it in fully, some have brought it in a modified basis. And that could just be due to their local laws and the intersection with nuclear and how they actually have to apply it. What's interesting to me, and I've gone on the websites and I try to look and say, well, what are the modifications that they make? Whatever you read on websites, sometimes you just really have to talk to the regulators to say, how did you actually do it? And by way of example, I will say when international financial reporting standards came in, and I used to note on websites, they'd say, 100 countries have adopted this. And I used to do a lot of training for the Asian Development Bank, and I would be over in these countries, and I would be asking, like whether it was the Philippines or Malaysia, and they'd say, well, we adopted IFRS. And I'd say, really? And I'd talk to them, and they say, but except for the financial instrument standard, and except for this standard, and except for that standard. And I'm like, okay, so it's a bit, you'll have to take this with a grain of salt to really know how a country is actually going to adopt it and implement it as part of research, and I think that we will do that. I'm going to talk about our committee in a few minutes. It will be important to reach out to these bodies to understand how they did it, what were their limitations, what did their research show, just things that we'll need to consider as the profession in Canada. And so far it seems the major concern for non-adopters, and I'm not surprised by this, is just the lack of whistleblowing protections that are available in legislation. Okay. So what is CPA profession response in Canada? I think that it's fair to say, and I mean, I'm pretty passionate about whistleblowing. I think it's an important thing, is that this is a positive change for the accounting profession. It's about doing the right thing, which is what I think we all signed up to do. I think it's going to instill a greater accountability in organizations. So if you look at the positive side of nuclear, I think that when you're a professional accountant in business and you've got the pressures that happen in public companies, and you're an auditor, that if those that aren't professional accountants and aren't captured by nuclear understand what the obligations are on us as professional accountants, then they're going to be accountable because they're going to know there's consequences if they don't act. I used to always say to public companies who were very concerned about whistleblowing and about people coming forward, and I said, we'll never get a whistleblower. I used to always say at the OSC, I might not ever need to get one. I just need you to think that one might come forward, and then you'll come in and self-report and clean it up, and it'll all be done. So I think that people knowing that this is a possibility, they're going to make sure that their internal controls are testing for this stuff, and that they're raising issues accordingly, and when they identify something, they're acting on it in and themselves and not leaving it down to the professional accountants to actually have to come forward. I think that we recognize that the nuclear, to the extent that, and how we adopt it, it's going to really help with public accountants competing priorities of acting in the public interest and their duty of confidentiality. So, for example, in the OSC whistleblower program, accountants are not obligated to come forward, but if they do come forward, then they could be considered an eligible whistleblower and paid. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't waive their duty of confidentiality under their code of conduct. So to the extent that that became known that they had come forward, there's always the possibility that a provincial regulatory authority could say, well, you violated the code. And so this standard will actually help professional accountants not have to decide between the two. But what I would say is nuclear is very novel. There's a lot of information in there, a lot of loaded words, and for us to implement it as a profession, it has to be done in a very thoughtful way and with a lot of research. And the Public Trust Committee, I sit on the Public Trust Committee. It's made up of regulatory staff from the provincial bodies and CPA Canada. We meet down at CPA, thank you, Joy, CPA Canada offices all the time. And I know, Jim, you think it's going to take forever, but Joy won't let us do that. So what we're doing is we're meeting and we're talking about nuclear. And we're doing research, so we're trying to figure out implementation in other jurisdictions, limitations, concerns. We will be looking at the various legislation across, what whistleblower protections are in, what we think that we need, what we would have to strive for to get. And in addition, we have a subset of that that's also looking at the code to try to figure out if NOCLR is implemented, what are the provisions within the code that we would have to change in order to make this so. So this work is ongoing, and it's kind of a stay tuned. And so here are some of the issues that I think that we have to consider as a profession. So the first one I talk about all the time is whistleblower protection. So, for example, I know that the OSC has a regime. So if you are a public accountant in business, that you have protections, because if you come in and you report to the OSC, they've made certain actions an offense under the Ontario Securities Act. One is that you cannot be retaliated against your employer, so that's a breach of the Securities Act, and the Ontario Securities Commission could take action against the company. They may never have to. The deterrence of that alone might make companies not retaliate against employees. They've actually also looked at the provisions in contracts. If you look in companies, you'll see that there was confidentiality provisions. What they've said is that those provisions that are intended to silence whistleblowers are unenforceable. And so companies are looking at that, so that people, they're taking those provisions out, so that those people that do whistleblow have an ability to go forward and not breach their confidentiality provisions contractually. And lastly, there's a civil right of redress for those that are retaliated against to privately sue for damages. So when you look at that, you'd have to say, well, that's securities law in only one province. So all the other laws that were listed there, you'd have to look to say, well, what are the protections if one came forward in those? And are they the same? And then what do we need to actually try to seek or really engage governments to put in? So then there's also the impacts of NOCLR on the relationships between the public, the professional accountants and their clients, employers, boards. So you've also got to worry that if NOCLR, would NOCLR have a chilling effect, because it's really important for auditors to get all of the information. So we've got to consider that. You've got to consider if you're a professional accountant on a board and you have a fiduciary duty to the corporation. Again, how does that work with NOCLR? What are the intersections of that? Third point would be legal liability, insurance exposure that would result from NOCLR disclosures. Again, some of the words in the NOCLR standard, when you look at it, is it's not just a known non-compliance, it's also suspected. Accountants aren't adjudicators. I mean, that's left to the court to decide that. So you can see that there may be some issues when people do come forward and make those disclosures. Jim alluded to this, and I think Bruce as well, just increased public expectations on professional accountants, particularly auditors. And also there could be unintended consequences, which is professional services moving from non-professional accountants. So if you, just by way of example, if you know that your tax accountant is bound by NOCLR, but your tax lawyer is not, maybe that's going to make a decision with respect to who you want to engage. Enforcement actions related to non-compliance with NOCLR. So again, this is well down the road, but whenever there's a corporate failure, I can tell you there's always a slate of regulation and enforcement actions, because everybody starts looking at how did this happen? Did somebody do the right thing? Is there an action that we need to take to put deterrents out in the public so that this doesn't happen again? So I think that we will see that eventually happening. There could be also other unintended consequences, which is if you are a public accountant that's a senior person in business and you know that you're bound by NOCLR disclosures, as does your employer. And I'm not saying that people aren't going to do the right thing. The majority of people do the right thing every single day. But if you are that person and you're well known, do you still think you need your designation? Does your designation put you in a position where you may be subject to an enforcement action later for the judgment that you made or the decision that you made in not coming forward? So, would we have unintended consequences there? Because people would say, well, I don't really want to be governed by NOCLR, but I still do the right thing. And then lastly, I would say that the other consideration for us as a profession is really engaging other stakeholders. It's other professions, it's the governments, it's academia, about the training. doing the right thing and preventing harm, serious like financial harm, environmental harm, it can't just be left to the professional accountant to solve this. There's a lot of other professions that are involved in this. And so as part of the work that we're doing on the Public Trust Committee is looking at this and trying to figure out which other stakeholders that we need to reach out to, and particularly I'd say governments, to try to get them to focus on the fact that this is an important objective, and how best can all of us play a role in preventing significant harm for the society at large. Thank you.